Back in December, I did a video about 10 albums that most influenced my taste in music. The fact is, there's more than that. So here's another 10 that have played a part in my musical journey. The albums are in order of their release year, and I'm going to start with the oldest first. So we're starting off with 1963's The Shadows' Greatest Hits. My dad had the LP, and even though I was only 2 when it came out, I can distinctly remember that silhouetted cover grabbing my attention. I think this album was the start of my love for instrumentals. I can remember the album playing in our arcade during the summer, and tunes like Wonderful Land, Dance On, Man of Mystery, and of course Apache being tunes I've grown up with. I loved Hank Marvin's guitar playing. I can spot it absolutely anywhere. Speaking of good guitarists, next up we go to 1968 and the album Feliciano by Jose Feliciano. I didn't know the album when it came out. It's one that I came across sometime in the late 70s. Of course, I was aware of his version of Light My Fire, but it wasn't until one day when I was in a record shop flicking through the records that I came across the album. Looking for the track list, I didn't expect to know any of the other songs on it besides Light My Fire, and was surprised to see another 7 covers on an album of 11 songs. This intrigued me, so I bought it. I like it when a cover is done in a slightly different way from the original, and that's what he'd done on this album. His versions of Sunny and Don't Let the Sun Catch You Crying are stunning. I like the fact that 2 of the Beatles songs he covered are instrumentals. This album led me to think about checking out albums that I wouldn't have otherwise looked at. In 1973, I'd heard of 10cc for the first time. Donna was the first song I'd heard, and if I'm honest, I thought it sounded a bit like the Beatles song Oh Darling on the Abbey Road LP. Then I heard Rubber Bullets and thought, that's good as well. So I went and bought the album. And then, not long afterwards, they released The Dean and I. All 3 singles are on this album, and it started me collecting their records. Over the years, I've collected another 6 of their LPs, but this is the one that started me off on another little musical journey. And what a great one it was. In 1975, I was in London's East End, walking along Roman Road, when I went into a record shop. And while I was flicking through the albums, I came across Elton John's Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. First of all, the cover was magnificent. I was engrossed in it. I wasn't really an Elton John fan. I'd liked Daniel and Crocodile Rock, but hadn't really thought of him as anyone special. I think I bought that album purely because I liked the cover. But from the minute I put the album on, I was drawn in. The songs were like stories, and I really enjoyed the fact that I liked all of them. I liked the way the album changed from one song to the next, and by the time I got to Someone Saved My Life Tonight at the end of side 1, I'd realised that this was an album that I'd be playing a lot. I think this was the album that got me turned on to storytelling songs. In the late summer of 1976, there was a song that was played a lot on British radio that I really liked. It was by a singer called Al Stewart, and it was called Year of the Cat. I had heard that there was a longer version of the song on the album, so I went and bought it because of that. Year of the Cat was an album I only bought because of that one song. But on playing, I realised that it was really very good. On the Border, Midas Shadow, and Sand in My Shoes were all songs I really liked as well. It was another of those albums that led me into a different style of music. I'd always liked Gladys Knight records, but I'd never bought any of her albums. I remember my brother having a compilation album of her early 60s songs, which I'd liked, but I'd not been tempted to buy one until I heard the song So Sad the Song. And so in 1976, I bought the soundtrack album to the film Pipe Dreams, just because it had that song on it. Now, it's nowhere near her best album, but it's the one that made me realise how much I liked her as an artist. The title track could almost make me cry. Nobody But You gave me hope that one day I'd find someone who cared for me that much. And I liked the up-tempo-ness of Alaskan Pipeline. But the standout one for me was the semi-instrumental song Pot of Jazz, which made me start looking at the jazzy side of soul. In the summer of 1978, I was really into disco and funk, which makes this next choice all the more surprising. The Boomtown Rats came to me out of left field, and I really liked them. So much so that I bought their album, Tonic for the Troops. I'd kind of liked punk, but not enough to buy any of the LPs. But these weren't really punk. For me, they seemed to piggyback onto the punk scene, but I found them really interesting in a way that made me want to hear more. There was something more quirky about them, and I found that besides the hit singles like Clockwork, She's So Modern and Rat Trap, to the drum intro into Blind Date, and the fact that even they were saying, "Don't believe what you read," even before I cottoned onto the newspapers. The Boomtown Rats were a new direction for me. Let's move on to my last three albums, which were all released in 1979. First up, an album that as a 19-year-old was always one that I didn't let anyone know anything about. I had it on a cassette as I'd not long passed my driving test and had my first car. When I bought this next album, it was 1980 and my car seemed to be full of cassettes featuring the likes of Diana Ross, Chic and the new up-and-coming reggae band called UB40, which all my mates loved. But when I was on my own, I'd pull out Barry Manilow's Manilow Magic compilation from under my driving seat and put that on. I talked earlier about how Elton John's album turned me onto story songs. And this album to me was magnificent. All the time, Looks Like We Made It, and Trying to Get That Feeling Again would all get me singing out loud when I was in the car on my own. Until I heard this album, I'd thought that the likes of Barry Manilow as my mum and dad's music. But this album got me looking to artists I'd never have dreamed of listening to. The fact that I love what's known as easy listening music is down to this album. It opened another area of music to me that has given me so much enjoyment over the years. In 1979, the song Street Life made a huge impression on me. For starters, it introduced me to Randy Crawford. But what I really loved about that song was the music in the background. And because of that music, I bought the album. And I wasn't disappointed. Their late night jazz vibe opened my eyes to another scene for me, one that led me to a plethora of new artists I'd never heard of before. I can remember playing this album over and over and over again and marvelling at how good it was. This album reminds me of summer days when I'd be out in my car with this playing in the background to journeys back and forth to Lowestoft where we were at the time. And finally, to my mind, his greatest work, Michael Jackson's Off the Wall, was just the perfect album for the time in my life. Rock With You, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and the title track were huge. They were songs we seemed to hear all the time back then. And at 19, I was having the time of my life. Those three songs were part of the soundtrack of the time, but the album was full of songs that I loved. The cover of Paul McCartney's Girlfriend was so good, as was It's the Falling in Love and I Can't Help It. That album turned him into a superstar, and it coincided with one of the best years of my life. So that's it. Another 10 albums that have played a part in defining the music I like, which in turn says a lot about me. Please feel free to comment about the choices down below. And here's the thing though, they're just my choices. You don't have to like them. After all, we all have different tastes. One thing's for sure though, each of these albums has led me on a journey to discover a lot of other albums and artists. And if you click up there, you can take a look at the first 10 albums that influenced my taste in music. I'll see you next time.